In 1955, the United States government carved a base out of a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert and told almost no one it existed. For nearly 60 years, officially, that base wasn't real. So why did thousands of people spend decades convinced it was hiding aliens? Here is what we know for certain. Groom Lake sits inside a vast military range northwest of Las Vegas. The CIA selected it in April 1955 for one purpose: to test a new spy plane called the U-2. The lake bed was flat, remote, and surrounded by mountains that blocked outside eyes. It was, in the words of the men who chose it, perfect. The U-2 could fly higher than any Soviet fighter or missile of its era, above 70,000 feet, where the sky turns almost black even at noon. Pilots wore what were essentially spacesuits, pressurized against an atmosphere that would boil the blood in seconds if the cabin failed. For years, this aircraft photographed Soviet military sites with a clarity that changed the entire balance of the Cold War. And it did so from a runway that, on paper, was not there. The workers who built that runway lived in a kind of controlled unreality. They flew in on unmarked planes from a private terminal in Las Vegas, worked shifts of a week or more without contact with their families, and signed documents making it a federal crime to describe what they'd seen for the rest of their lives. Some of them kept that silence for over 40 years. When they finally spoke decades later, what they described wasn't extraterrestrial. It was concrete, radar dishes, and hangars built fast enough that construction crews sometimes worked around the clock, under floodlights bright enough to be seen from the mountains. Here is the anomaly that started everything. The U-2's silver skin at extreme altitude caught sunlight in a way that made it look like a moving fireball. Commercial airline pilots reported it. Radar operators reported it. Throughout the late 1950s, UFO sightings over the American Southwest spiked. And the Air Force couldn't explain most of them, because explaining them meant admitting the U-2 existed. So officers were told to say something else: weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, anything but the truth. That silence created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. By the 1980s, the base's mythology had grown far beyond a spy plane. Bob Lazar, a physicist, or a man who claimed to be one, came forward in 1989 saying he'd worked on reverse-engineered alien spacecraft at a facility near the base called S4. He described propulsion systems powered by an element that, at the time, didn't exist on the periodic table. His story spread across radio, then television, then the early internet, faster than anyone could verify it. Investigators later found no record he'd ever worked there, and no record he held the physics degrees he claimed. But by then, it didn't matter. The story had already become bigger than the man who told it. Here's the theory that took hold hardest: that the government had recovered crashed alien technology, possibly from Roswell in 1947, and was quietly reverse engineering it in the desert, decades ahead of any public timeline. It explained the secrecy. It explained the strange aircraft shapes people reported. It explained why a base surrounded by warning, deadly force authorized signs needed to exist at all. There was another theory, quieter but just as persistent, that the sightings were real aircraft, just not from anywhere near Earth's future. Man-made stealth prototypes, decades ahead of what the public assumed possible. Triangular shapes, silent engines, impossible acceleration, impossible for what people thought technology could do in 1962, or 1975, or 1989. A third theory sat between the two, and it's the one that actual pilots who flew near the range tended to believe. Not aliens, not ordinary planes, something in between. Experimental engines that ran hotter and stranger than anything on public record. Tested by men who'd been told, explicitly, that if they were ever asked what they flew, the correct answer was nothing. One retired test pilot, decades after his service ended, said the hardest part wasn't keeping the secret from strangers. It was keeping it from his own children, who assumed, for years, that their father simply had a boring desk job at an airbase in the desert. Now here's the detail that changes what we thought we knew. In 2013, the CIA declassified an internal history of the U-2 program. Buried in more than 400 pages was a single admission. Area 51 existed. The government named it directly, and roughly half of all UFO reports in Nevada during the Cold War were misidentified test flights of U-2s and later the A-12 Oxcart, a Mach 3 spy plane so radical that even trained pilots who saw it in the sky assumed it couldn't be real. Half. Not explained away with a shrug. Documented, dated, and tied to specific test flights. The government hadn't been hiding aliens. It had been hiding the fact that it could build aircraft faster and higher than anything the Soviets or the public believed possible. And it let an alien cover story run wild for decades because a UFO rumor was infinitely safer than the Kremlin learning what was actually flying over Nevada. That's not a smaller story than the one people wanted. It might be a stranger one, a cover-up so effective it convinced a generation that fiction was more plausible than the truth sitting right in front of them. This isn't the only place secrecy created a myth stranger than the reality. There's a pattern in how governments handle things they can't explain publicly. And we've traced a very different version of it in another story. One that starts with a lake that turns animals to stone. By the time the base was formally acknowledged, the culture around it had become self-sustaining. Documentaries, late-night radio shows, entire tourist economies in the nearby town of Rachel, Nevada, built around a rumor the government itself had encouraged, simply by refusing to speak. Storming Area 51, a 2019 internet joke that drew federal attention and hundreds of actual visitors to the gates, was, in its own strange way, the final form of that 60-year silence. People weren't stopping to see aliens. They were stopping because no one had ever told them, clearly, why they shouldn't. Groom Lake is still active. Satellite images show new construction as recently as the past few years. New hangars, an expanded runway, structures that weren't there a decade ago. Whatever flies there now is almost certainly not the story anyone is telling on the internet, and almost certainly not extraterrestrial. It's something else the government isn't ready to explain yet, sitting behind the same mountains that hid the U-2 70 years ago, protected by the same strategy. Let people believe almost anything, as long as it isn't the truth. Consider what that strategy actually required. Not force, not even much lying in the end, just silence, held long enough, in a country built on the assumption that secrets always leak eventually. For 60 years, this one didn't have to. The rumor did the government's work for it, for free, and better than any official denial ever could have. Which leaves the real question sitting exactly where it always was. Not what's hidden at Area 51, but how much of what we believe about anything kept secret from us was actually a story we built ourselves, in the silence someone else left on purpose.